Happy October, guys. Continuing on in this month where I talk about serial killer type movies to get in that Halloween spirit, I figure why not talk about the most highly acclaimed serial killer movie ever made. The Silence of the Lambs. That's right, it's The Silence of the Lambs, not Silence of the Lambs. Even though I'll probably just be saying Silence of the Lambs throughout most, if not all of this video, because that's just what I'm more used to saying. But Silence of the Lambs came out in 1991 and was the third movie ever to win the Big Five at the Academy Awards. So you know this isn't just some small horror movie. This was kind of a big deal back in 1991, and if you've seen any manhunt serial killer type movie made since 1991, I bet you it was informed at least in some part by The Silence of the Lambs. And that is a lot of praise to heap onto Silence of the Lambs, a movie that is probably one of the most uncomfortable movies you can watch and sit through, and it just makes your skin crawl from beginning to end. And I mean, that's the point, but it kind of blows my mind that the Academy was so taken by this. It doesn't really feel like the type of movie that the Academy would nominate or even have win any of these categories. But at the end of the day, I guess it is hard to argue against Silence of the Lambs. The awards it got definitely deserved because everybody is firing on all cylinders, starting with our lead Jodie Foster as Clarice Starling. And the movie opens with her training at the FBI Academy. That's right, she's not an official FBI agent at this point. She's still a student trainee. She's trying to get her badge, trying to graduate. She's so close. And there just happens to be this new serial killer on the loose called Buffalo Bill. He's already killed multiple women. And Jack Crawford, played by Scott Glenn, you know, Stick from Daredevil, yeah, he's in this movie. It's actually pretty cool to put that together. And Crawford sees some potential in Clarice, so he's like, okay, I'm gonna give you a shot. You're gonna work on this Buffalo Bill case, but first I need you to go to Baltimore and conduct an interview with this serial killer that we've caught years ago. His name's Dr. Hannibal the Cannibal Lecter. Yes, he's a dude that ate people and probably still eats people if given the opportunity, to see if he can't shed some light on the Buffalo Bill case. And Starling, being maybe a little naive, but mostly just enthusiastic, wanting to prove herself, she takes us on. And it's here where we're introduced to probably the most interesting character in this movie, and that is Dr. Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins. And what can I say about Anthony Hopkins' performance here that hasn't been said before? It's iconic, it's menacing, it's intense, it's psychologically twisted. You're not entirely sure if you want to root for him or root against him, because he's not the villain of the piece. The main villain is Buffalo Bill, the serial killer that they're actually trying to get. The relationship between Hannibal and Clarice is more of a unwelcome alliance, an alliance of convenience. Convenient for who? First you think it's convenient for the FBI, they're getting all this information, but by the end you know it's actually convenient for Lecter in a lot of ways. But first I want to remind you that Anthony Hopkins did win Best Lead Actor in this movie in a role that only gave him really not that much runtime. When you look at other leading men that have won Academy Awards for their performances, Anthony Hopkins doesn't get a lot of screen time. On paper, I think you'd even consider him a supporting character. He's not the protagonist, he's not the main antagonist, and he's not even really a partner on this case from beginning to end. That honor has to go to Jack Crawford, her boss. I'm pretty sure Jack Crawford gets minute by minute more screen time than Anthony Hopkins does, but as great as Jack is in this movie, that's not the type of role that's gonna really win you any awards. It's gonna go to Hannibal Lecter because that's what everyone remembers when they leave the theater. I also love the setup and payoff of Hannibal Lecter in this movie too, because the first time you see him, there's so much build up to who this guy is. You know that he's a cannibal, you know that this was years ago, and that the FBI has been keeping a real close eye on him even after he got arrested. And then when she gets to Baltimore, she meets Dr. Chilton, who's probably the creepiest psychologist you'll ever see. Aside from, you know, the cannibal, because he's also a psychologist, but something about Dr. Chilton's personality, it's so slimy and gross, and he keeps hitting on Clarice, and that's just not welcome. And while I'm on the subject, people hitting or looking down on Clarice because she's a woman is kind of a through line throughout this movie. This is a very woman in a man's world type of horror movie, and if you watch this movie with that lens, it does lend to some interesting observations. You kind of pick up on a few things, like the fact that there's a lot of intense close-ups on men's faces staring directly into the camera, and then the reverse of that is a close-up on Clarice, so they're just looking right at her with these piercing eyes. Especially Anthony Hopkins as Lecter, he's like the king of it in this movie. But Chilton does it, Jack does it, Buffalo Bill definitely does it throughout the entire climax, and again, I'm getting ahead of myself. But that's just another small detail that this movie has to get across its message without beating you over the head with it. What this movie beats you over the head with is just discomfort and disgust for a lot of it, which is probably the correct emotion you want to evoke when you're talking about this subject matter. You really are getting a glimpse at just the worst kinds of people in this movie. People that are power hungry, people that are manipulative, people that just have such disregard for human life. It's just disgusting. And that really is the horror of The Silence of the Lambs. It's not jump scares, it's not creepy imagery, it's not these over-the-top CGI monsters, it's people. And it's the depravity of people that's probably the scariest thing of all. It doesn't really hype it up with a lot of fanfare and fancy camera work to really get your attention. It's shot and acted and delivered basically like an episode of Criminal Minds or any other crime procedural. That's really the bones of this story. And I don't know if that's the credit of this movie, or the credit should go to Thomas Harris, who wrote the book and actually wrote a series of books about Hannibal Lecter and different serial killers. And a lot of, if not all of them, have been turned into movies. And I haven't read any of them, so I can't really say how accurate this is. But I do think it's interesting that a movie I'm going to be talking about next week, Red Dragon, has had at least 3 different film-ish adaptations. One of them was a TV show, but it's been adapted a few times. To my knowledge, this movie is the only adaptation of The Silence of the Lambs. And I think that's the case because this movie just knocked it out of the park in such a memorable way. I don't think anybody else really wanted to touch it after that. But anyway, back to the story. So Clarice is going to visit Hannibal Lecter, and it's building up. You're learning more about him, what he did to this nurse. He tried to eat her tongue and bleh. And so you're thinking, who is this monster? And then you're being taken down into the inner sanctum of the prison, and you have these underground cells. It's all dirty and gross, and you see her walk by these other serial killers, and they're all crazy and manic and fidgety and gross. And if you're playing along at home, try to keep count of how many times I say the word gross, because this is a gross movie. Then you get to Hannibal Lecter's cell at the very end of the hallway, and it's this kind of polite British man who's not that tall. He's kind of short and pudgy, and is that really the monster that was built up? And right away your brain goes into this cognitive dissonance where you're like, that's not the cannibal that I was imagining. I was imagining like a Jeffrey Dahmer Killer Croc situation. This guy looks like he could be a college professor or something. It doesn't look that threatening, but then he opens his mouth, and right away the red flags go up, and you're like, oh, it's not about the physical, it's the psychological games that Lecter plays, because he's a psychologist. He knows people, he knows human psychology to a T, and so when he gets under your skin, when you start sharing some personal details, he can make inferences, and he can get you to do or say things that you otherwise wouldn't do, but he's just so many steps ahead of you, you don't even know what's happening. And that's why Anthony Hopkins left such an impression on people back in 1991 with his limited screen time. And the other thing that this movie does that its sequel, Hannibal, no, not the show, but the movie Hannibal with Anthony Hopkins, fails to do, is that in this movie they know how to shoot and light Hannibal Lecter to make him look intimidating. Because like I said before, if you take him at face value, he's not that threatening. But when you have those really claustrophobic close-ups of the eyes and they're just piercing right at Starling. And on top of that, there's a lot of high contrast lighting in his cell, and also later on as the movie progresses, he's in a few different areas. But the lighting stays consistent where you have this high contrast. It highlights the shadows, the wrinkles, the sunken eyes, making him look so much more threatening and predatory than he would if you were to just walk up to him in the street. And I guess now's as good a time as any to talk about the real villain of this story, and that's Buffalo Bill. And Buffalo Bill, for me, has to be the #1 fictional character in any movie, TV show, comic book, any piece of media. Buffalo Bill is #1 for the character that just makes my skin crawl, because he is such a gross human being through and through. It's actually kind of the perfect contrast to Hannibal Lecter, because Hannibal Lecter is this polite, gentlemanly serial killer, so you know that there's something going on behind the eyes. But Buffalo Bill has none of the charisma or charm or personality that Lecter has. He is just a monster. He is after these women. He is not going to stop. He's going to try any shady trick in the book to get them into his van so he can kidnap them and then do unspeakable things to them. And I'd like to keep this video not age restricted, so I'm not going to go into all the details, but let's just say Buffalo Bill likes to sew, and his material of choice is women's skin. He wants to make himself a suit. Yeah, and in this movie you see quite a bit of that, and probably more than anybody ever wanted to, and it leaves an impression, to say the least. But around this point in the movie, Buffalo Bill kidnaps another girl, and she's the daughter of the senator from Tennessee, and now the clock is ticking to see if Clarice and Hannibal Lecter can work together, get a profile on Bill, so that they can rescue this girl before it's too late. And that's really the driving focus of this movie. Can they get enough information? Can they do enough detective work to weed out this guy? That's the movie. Then every time we cut back to Buffalo Bill and the house he's in, and the dungeon, and the well, it just adds to that pressure where you're like, oh, he could really just kill her at any moment. And we don't know how much time she has. So in that regard, the movie never really lets up. From the time this girl gets kidnapped to the end of the movie, there is no breathing room. It's just discomfort and anxiety from beginning to end. And I mean that in the best possible way. And because of this urgency, Lecter has a deal with the FBI where he's going to deliver that profile in person to the woman's mother. And if you think that making deals with serial killers is a bad idea, well, yeah, this was a bad idea, and it backfires harshly. Because Lecter, of course, escapes from this, but not before we get the Hannibal Lecter mask scene where he's being transported and he's all tied up in a straitjacket and he's on like a dolly thing, and he's got the mask. You know the mask I'm talking about. The I can't bite your face off mask that every Halloween store has in bulk supply because it's just such an iconically creepy mask. Now what's kind of funny is that this mask for a long time was just a standard issue piece of insane asylum equipment, had no real special meaning behind it. Nowadays it's known as the Hannibal Lecter mask because of this one scene, and the scene's not even that long. It's maybe 5 minutes, and then he's in his cell, and most of this movie he's not wearing the mask. He's wearing just like normal prison clothes, and he's either behind bars or he's behind glass, and he just looks like Anthony Hopkins' face. But for some reason this one scene really stuck with people, and like I can understand why. It's an iconic look, it's very memorable, it'll stick in your head. But I just kind of have to laugh that this is not the look that he has throughout the majority of this movie or the majority of this franchise. And I should probably talk about how Lecter ends up escaping this maximum security prison hotel thing. It's kind of a temporary prison because they did transfer him to Tennessee to meet the senator, so he's held up in this big hotel. And they made this kind of ridiculous. I say ridiculous because just thinking logistically, it's probably not the accommodations he would actually have if we're talking realism, but this is a Hollywood movie. Some things are elevated. This does have a sense of heightened reality, although it's still very gritty and grounded for a lot of it. There are still moments that you look at it and you're like, yeah, that's kind of a Hollywood moment. And his temporary accommodations is proof of that. And he does meet with Clarice, and they have a nice scene where they talk about lambs. And I don't really feel the need to get into the whole lambs situation in this video, because while thematically it does work, and I highly suggest that you watch it so you actually understand what the title is even talking about, because once you understand the title you're like, oh, so that's really what the movie's about, and it's this other perspective. It's not just about serial killers, it's about Clarice and her life. But this video is going on long enough. I'm trying to condense it, so instead I want to talk about how he escapes, because it's actually really smart, because this is probably the scene that actually wins you over into rooting for Hannibal Lecter. Even though you know that you shouldn't, you still kind of respect him because just how smart and clever he is in his escape. And it goes down like this. He ate dinner, then he met with Clarice, and he learned about the lambs and everything, and then it's like, okay, I got an idea. So he orders a second dinner, lamb chops, and that's kind of a nice little thematic moment right there. But he palms the bone after dinner, and when the guards, one of which is played by Charles Napier, who was Murdoch in Rambo First Blood Part 2, and I just think that's really funny because he was such an unlikable jerk in that movie. I kind of like seeing him get his comeuppance in this movie. But anyway, they handcuff him to the bars while they open up his cell to take out the plate. But because he palmed that bone, he's able to pick the lock. And before you know it, he's literally on top of these guys, and he actually grabs one of the dude's face and bite him right in the mouth. And I will say that shot of him giving the dude the most aggressive kiss ever put to film is one of the few shots and effects that just don't quite work for me. It just seems a little silly. I don't think the lighting was there. I don't think the timing was quite there to make it as horrifying as the movie clearly wants it to be. Now later on in the scene it definitely makes up for it, but that one shot of him grabbing the dude by the head and give him big ol' smooch and his face all red, I don't know, it just doesn't quite get there in the horror department for me. But after he bites one dude's face and starts beating up the other dude with his own nightstick, you don't really see Lecter for a while. It's played from the police's perspective. You know Lecter's loose and he's out and you don't know where he is. But again, you don't know where he is. And the police find one of the guards lying there unconscious, but he's still breathing, he's still hanging on. His face is all mutilated and gross. And the other guy, I don't think YouTube will let me actually show you the picture of what he did to that guy, but let's just say he turned him into some kind of gutted angel, and he's just strung up on the cell. And yeah, that's another one of those big Hollywood dramatic moments that don't really feel that realistic, but it is a very memorable image and very gross. So the police are still looking for Lecter, trying to find out what floor he's on, while they're bringing this half-dead guard into the ambulance to try to save his life. But then you realize that the guard is actually Hannibal Lecter wearing the guard's face. And that's just 10 times more disgusting than the scene already was, and is a fantastic reveal. And he kills pretty much everybody in that ambulance and escapes, and scot-free. And that's really only the midpoint, maybe, of the movie, maybe the end of the second act. And for the whole third act, Hannibal Lecter is not in this movie. He's gone. Because why would he? He just got what he wanted. He got freedom. So why would he go and pal around with Clarice Starling for the climax of this movie? Doesn't make a lot of sense. And I guarantee you that some studio head or producer was thinking, oh, Hannibal Lecter is such an interesting character. We gotta bring him back for the third act somehow. And either the director or somebody was like, no, just play it straight. And I'm not 100% sure that that conversation happened, but knowing how Hollywood works, it feels like that's what happened. But I really do respect the filmmaker's decision to keep him out of the third act, because this is Clarice Starling's movie, and she needs to hunt down Buffalo Bill. And in this third act, she is using good old-fashioned detective work to try to figure out who Buffalo Bill is based on Lecter's clues and anagrams. And she does end up finding Buffalo Bill's residence. The only downside is that, for one, she's not even fully FBI yet, and two, her boss, Jack Crawford, and all the other FBI agents think they've found Buffalo Bill's hideout, but they are states away and sadly mistaken. And I love the climax of this movie. It's so smart and intentional, because the way it's edited at the start, you see Jack leading this raid on this house trying to get Buffalo Bill, while at the same time Clarice is at Buffalo Bill's actual house. But the way it's edited, you're not entirely sure which house is the correct house and who's actually at the house until you see Clarice open the door and she's by herself and she is face to face with Satan himself. And this is where all those scenes earlier in the movie where you see Clarice training at the academy all pays off in a big way, because in this climax when she is confronting Buffalo Bill and he's running and he's got a gun and she's got a gun, all of those moments where Clarice failed in her training come back and she does all of the correct decisions one after another. But then in one last attempt to get the upper hand, Buffalo Bill turns off all of the lights. Buffalo Bill's got night vision goggles so he can see her, but she can't see anything, let alone him. And I dare you to watch this sequence and not let your heart rate go above 100. Because I don't care if you're the most chill, laid-back person, nothing gets you anxious. This climax is just anxiety incarnate. You feel so scared for Clarice. You're just hoping that he'll make some noise or touch her, or just give her some reason to whip around, pull out her gun, and shoot the guy dead. And after what feels like an eternity of just stumbling around in the darkness, Buffalo Bill cocks his gun, about to shoot her in the face, and she does exactly what she needs to. She whips around, shoots him. I'm pretty sure she unloads the clip into his chest. And with the convenient luck of hitting a window to let in some light, Buffalo Bill falls down dead. You see him bleed out on the floor. And on top of that, the movie ends with Clarice getting her badge. She graduates with this big happy ending. It doesn't really stay happy, because right where you think the movie is going to end, she gets a phone call. And it's Hannibal Lecter on the phone. And you're left with this feeling of uneasiness where you know that Hannibal Lecter is out there. And there's nothing you can really do to stop him. He's not going to come after Clarice. She's not really in danger, but he's out there. And that's just not a happy note to end on. And those are my thoughts on The Silence of the Lambs. Guys, there's a reason this won the Big Five. There's a reason it won Best Picture. It's a phenomenally made movie. It's one of those movies that is bigger than the genre that it came from. This is more than just a horror movie. It's more than just a detective thriller movie. It's just incredible. But I will tell you, this movie is not for everyone. If you don't like movies that make you uncomfortable and kind of squeamish and squirm in your chair and show you things you probably don't want to see, maybe this one's not for you. Maybe give it a pass. But if you're kind of like me, a little bit twisted in the head, and you want to get a creative and interesting glimpse at the most depraved parts of humanity and how they interact with law enforcement, this is the movie for you. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about Silence of the Lambs? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.